Hey, I'm Ray. I'm an award-winning VTuber artist, and today we're going to be going over loosely my process for creating VTuber models from art to rig. This is going to be a bit of a more casual video. It's not going to be like formally scripted. So if I miss anything or if you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe. Anyway, after the self-plug is over, let's get into it. So, my models always start where any other art that I make always starts, in a sketch. I go ahead and plan out the general vibes of the model. Sometimes I go in without really a character design in mind. Usually I don't do that, but, you know, sometimes. And during this phase is when I really try to plan out the big parts of the model. I try to figure out how I'm going to separate the head and the neck and the torso and the limbs. Since I've done this a lot, I tend to kind of have a vibe already of what I'm going to do, but you can see me here kind of overlapping the stomach from the hips, from the torso, the legs, the knees. I don't end up really rigging and even finalizing the rest of the lower body for time's sake, but you can kind of see the idea here of how I would break that up. Once I kind of get the general vibe down, that's when I go in and start cleaning it up. I'm going to kind of start with the color for the head, which may seem a little strange, but I'm going to be using a technique that some people call backfill, where I'm putting the quote-unquote line art as one big black circle behind the color so that I can use that to kind of blend the line art for the ears and the head a little bit smoother. You could also do this with things like masks and stuff like that. This is just one technique that you can do. It's very popular for things like hair, so that you can have multiple pieces of hair overlap, but then not have to kind of finagle the line art to behave. It can kind of have that seamless outline effect without having to do a bunch of extra work in the rigging process. Here I'm going ahead and coloring the eyelash and the eyelid. I'm coloring the eyelid a different color, mostly for the sake of making it clear when I'm working with it in this video, but you don't have to do that. That's just something I'm doing here for clarity. You may also notice that everything that I'm drawing is being duplicated on the left and the right side of the model at the same time. This is because I'm taking advantage of Clip Studio Paint's symmetry ruler, and I highly recommend using symmetry rulers when working on VTuber models for front-facing models. Obviously, if you have a model that's like facing off to the side, you don't want to have the symmetry applied, but it saves a lot of time and keeps things looking nice and clean across the left and the right planes. It does mean that everything that's on the left and the right will be on one layer that you'll have to go back in and clean up later, but for me, that's worth the time save of not having to copy and paste and make sure everything's aligned properly. Especially because once I get into the rigging process, I will be doing a lot of rig everything on the left side or the right side and then copying it over to the opposite side. And that way I have a perfect reference for where everything is going to be placed once I kind of reflect it across the XY axis. You may also notice that not every time that I draw is something perfectly reflected. You can accomplish this by either turning off the ruler or turning off the snapping to ruler, which is really helpful for just kind of adding quick things for asymmetry. Because asymmetry can add a lot of character to a model, it can add a lot of pizzazz, you know? It helps things from looking a little bit too sterile, a little bit too inhuman, I guess, because we're not perfectly symmetrical. Characters should also, similarly, not be perfectly symmetrical. That's just kind of a small character design tip for you. Adding little bits of asymmetry can add a lot of charm to a character. When I am coloring something more complicated, like rendering out the shininess of eyes, once I decide on a color at least, I tend to try and make sure that I'm splitting up the different aspects of the render into different layers. So we have like the pupil, we have the shadow, we have highlight 1, highlight 2, or however many highlights you end up having in your art. And then we have like the eyeshadow, as in like the shadow within the eye white, and then the eyeshadow on top of the eye, and then the little highlight above the eye itself. It's important to split all these out if you want to end up having those stereotypical, very expressive VTuber physics in the eyes. Splitting them out allows you to handle the motion for them all separately to get that kind of really jello-y effect where everything is kind of moving at a slightly different rate or at a slightly different time, which creates that really juicy eye, shiny eye look. I also make sure to split out the different eyelashes so that once I'm deforming the eyeline itself, I can handle the lashes separately to help me really create a 3D effect for them, and also handling physics for them. You don't have to end up splitting out these eyelashes, but it will make it harder to cleanly have the blink. I go ahead and add some shading. I like adding shading along the chin of the head to help with dimension when looking up and looking down and such. You don't have to have it as big and noticeable as I do. I end up actually making it smaller once I'm in the rigging program, but I like having it noticeably large so that I make sure I didn't forget it. And now that I have the base of the head done, I'm gonna go ahead and start on the mouth. I end up splitting my mouth into the dimples, which are separate on each side, the upper lip, which I end up copying to make the lower lip, the inside of the mouth, and for this particular example, I have like a mouth mask to make that kind of very anime style break in the lip when the mouth is closed. I also make sure when I have the inside of the mouth, I'm clipping aspects that are gonna go in the mouth to that like back of mouth shape. You can also do like an outer skin shape that I know that some riggers and artists prefer. I think that it would have been easier for me in this case if I'd done an upper lip, at least, which makes it a lot easier to hide the kind of insides of the mouth when the mouth is closed, as opposed to having to squish it all behind the lip line like I end up having to do. So, you know, you can do it. It's just a pain in the neck. I'm going ahead and adding like a bunch of different aspects to this mouth. I have the tongue, I have the lower teeth in the back, I have the upper teeth, and then I have the lower teeth in the front. I ended up making the lower teeth separated front and back just for kind of ease. And the front lower teeth and the upper teeth are going to have a little teeth mask so that when they're close enough together, you get kind of like a clean smile without the line breaking it up all along the way. Because I have thicker line art, that line tends to be very distracting when the mouth is closed. I end up using like a similar shape for both the lip mask and the teeth mask. I also end up moving my layers around to try and have it behind the blush so that the lip mask doesn't end up being very obvious. But once I'm in the rigging program, I end up messing with that because then the inside of the mouth is affected by the blush, and I don't really want that either. So, you know, potato, tomato, pros and cons. I also want to go ahead and point out that I am adjusting things as I draw them. It is totally fine to draw something, decide you don't like where it's placed, and move it later. Even as I've done this for a really long time, I'm still always making mistakes and undoing things, trying again, things like that. I also go ahead and fill out the neck. I've been experimenting with making the neck have this round orb at the back. That's sort of to help create a space for the head turns to show so that the head doesn't end up just showing blank space behind the neck. You can also just rig the neck to not show blank space. It's totally up to you. Now, I went ahead and just decided to export out with just the head and the upper body done. I ended up forgetting to record the upper body. I'm so sorry. It was just line art and fill color. Nothing exciting. And so now we're going to go ahead and end up splitting all of the stuff out into the left and right sides. This part is pretty tedious for me. Because I use the symmetry tool like I mentioned earlier, I have to make sure that I split everything down the middle. I want everything that would go on the right side of the face to be the right side, and everything that would go on the left side of the face to be the left side. The reason that I don't want them to be in a single layer is that when I'm rigging, if we say, for example, turn the head to the left, we would have one eye getting smaller and one eye getting bigger as it goes closer, and we don't want them blinking at the same time and things like that. Their motion would be separated, therefore we want the layer to be separated. Same thing with like the left and right ears, the left and right arms, etc. I also make sure at this point to rasterize down any layer effects that I have. For example, in Clip Studio Paint, I use the layer outline tool a lot, so I want to be sure that that outline actually takes with the layer when we import it into Live 2D. So those are the kind of things I do at this step. Mostly I call this step layer management. I mostly am naming things and separating down the middle. There's not a whole lot of interesting things in this step. It's just something you gotta do to make sure that you can rig your art properly. If you end up messing up anything at this step, you can always resave the Photoshop document and export it on out again. And as long as you didn't heavily alter like the hierarchy of the file or the size of the file, it should all import and save over the existing layers, or you may end up getting new layers that you can then restructure back down into the hierarchy. I ended up having to do that a few times. I didn't record those times, but just know that even when I've been doing this a lot, I don't always get it right on the first time, and that's totally okay. Once you've exported your Photoshop document, you're ready to go. I go ahead and just drag and drop my Photoshop document onto Live2D. You can also open it, whatever, works easiest for you. And then I go ahead and I re-clip down everything because Live2D never recognizes my clipping layers. So this is always a step that's annoying, but necessary. I go ahead and copy the ID of whatever layer I need to add things clipped down onto. So think of it as like the base layer that you would have had everything clipped down onto, you copy its ID and you paste it onto the layers that you need clipped down to it in its clipping ID field. So once I got that all taken care of, I go ahead and auto mesh most of the art. And then I want to have a more detailed mesh for parts of the model that I think will move the most. Live2D is pretty good at making meshes for you, but I find if I'm going to really be moving something and deforming something like the lips or the eyelashes or, things like that, I want to go ahead and create a mesh myself. I usually go about this by outlining the layer itself and then creating 2 lines around that outline that are offset to create little triangles. So basically, like for every point that I made on the first line, I put my new point in between. I don't have to do this perfectly, but the nicer the triangles look, the nicer the layer will deform once we're into that step. I go ahead and do that for the layers that I mentioned. I do it for the lips, I do it for the inner of the mouth, and the eyeline, which are my biggest deformations, especially because I'm not using lip skin. I'm going to need to really deform the back of the mouth to get it to hide behind those tiny little lip lines. I also go ahead and create a custom mesh for the eyelid here. This is because I'm going to attempt to use glue. Now, I've been working with Live2D for a really long time. I roughly understand how glue works. Essentially, it makes it so that any points along that mesh can't separate. And yet, I'm always confused when it comes to actually using it. I never remember what settings are quite right, which way I need to actually set it up, things like that. Because if you just do the default glue, you'll kind of feel like you're working against like a current when you're moving the layers itself. And I'm just really bad at understanding how glue works, even as long as I've worked with this stuff. So if there's parts of the program that you still don't quite understand, that is very normal. There is so much to know about Live2D. Now I go ahead and I start working on the head angles. I start with head angle Z because that one's always really easy. I just put down a rotation deformer and bing bang boom, we're done. The head X angle can be done a lot of different ways. I tend to go to the left and I move the base of the head and I try to like squish it and deform it. I try to think of like how the face moves when looking side to side. I tend to look up references for people's heads at a 3/4 angle or whatever angle that I'm feeling like pushing the model today. The angles that you can reach are always going to depend on how comfortable you are with the program as well as to how separated your art is. So if you feel like you can't quite push the angles that I do yet, that's totally fine. I didn't end up pushing angles until probably a couple years into my rigging, so don't feel discouraged. I go ahead and usually start with the base of the head and then I do the eye. You'll notice I don't do both eyes is because, like I mentioned, I'm going to copy and paste the rigging from one eye over onto the other eye. It would probably be more helpful if I hid the other eye, but I'm just being annoying, I guess, at myself. I go ahead and I do the ear and the nose. I just kind of pick whatever feels good to me in a moment. I don't really have like a super formal process. A lot of rigging to me is that I move things, I see how it looks, and then I keep messing with it until I feel like I like it. If it's a particular element that I feel like it's the same left or right, particularly things that are in the center or are perfectly spanned across the entirety of the head, you can do what's called reflect motion and get double bang for your buck on one rigging. You get to do it to the left side and then bam, it's copied over to the right. Woohoo! The only issue is that certain things, like I said, like the eye, where it'll move a different way coming towards you in one direction and going away from you another, you have to rig it both times because the reflection won't be the same. So you have to make sure that you are keeping that in mind when choosing what to reflect. If you reflect something and you end up being like, oh, that didn't work, you can always just undo. It's not any issue. I also go ahead and do something with the ear here where I'm messing with what it's called draw order. That determines what layer, essentially, the program is rendering it in like 3D space. The lower the number, the further back it'll be, and the higher the number, the further forward it'll be. So back in the drawing section, I mentioned putting the line art for the head kind of as a black backfill layer, and I'm using that here. I put it behind everything so you can see that now the line between the head and the neck is now just shadow, which I think looks really killer. You don't have to do it that way, that's just how I did it. And then I can have that line move behind the ear and forward in front of the ear when the head turns away, so that we have this kind of nice depth of field effect. Now I'm going ahead and I'm adding the depth to the mouth. I just kind of do the base of the mouth left and right. Because the mouth movement is the same, I can do it one direction, reflect it, see if I still like it, and mess with it that way. I'm also going to go ahead and do the Y angles before I start copying anything, so that I end up not having to re-rig two eyes. We do not have symmetrical rigging, so if you end up wanting something to move exactly the same left and right, you're going to have to either copy and paste it or just pray. It's really frustrating, but, you know, maybe someday. When I'm doing the Y angles, I tend to think of the top of the head moving away from us and when we look up and moving toward us when we look down. So anything further up on the head is going to kind of come closer to you when you look down and move further away from you when you look up, meaning it'll get smaller on the up and bigger on the down. And the reverse is true for things on the bottom of the head. Things on the bottom of the head will get smaller when you look down and bigger when you look up. This is the inverse motion of what you'll have going on the back of the head. So like your hair, think about it right now. If you look up, your hair line moves down closer to your shoulders. So your hair will move down, even though your head is going up. And the reverse is true when you look down. Your hairline moves away from your shoulders, so your hair gets pulled up. I tend to have the ears as kind of a middle ground in that case. They don't tend to move a lot, but they do rotate kind of inversely to what we might expect. The ears kind of move down when we look up and up when we look down. I go ahead and I just start cleaning up some depth of field with the inside of the mouth. I use the broken up tongue and teeth that I drew before to kind of create this depth inside the mouth when it's open, so that when you look to the left or the right, you kind of see the tongue deform away. One thing that I try to make sure that I keep in mind when I'm doing any head angle, especially with things like this detail, is that I want the height of the object to stay the same. So that's one way that you can make sure that you aren't like shrinking something instead of changing its perspective. Now, once I go ahead and do the corners, you could try synthesized corners. Synthesized corners, my beloved. I use them occasionally, but I find for head angles, it's just too complex. The program can't do it nicely. So what I ended up doing instead is that I select all of my meshes that are deformed on the Y, which will be all my art layers and deformers and everything. And I go to like the maximum X, so the maximum all the way to the right, and the maximum Y, so the up right corner, and I rotate the head up. I use a temporary deformer to do this, which you might notice whenever you select something, you'll have those two little red boxes, the X and then something that just looks like a grid. The grid is a temporary deformer tool, and I use that all the time. It is so helpful. And I use particularly the rotation one when I'm doing corners, because when you think about it, when you're looking up and down to the corner, you're kind of just looking to the left and then tilting your neck. It's not perfect. You tend to have to need a bit of cleanup, but it's a lot less cleanup and a much nicer place to start, for me at least, than synthesized corners tends to be. Now I'm going to go ahead and start on the blink. Because I want to go ahead and copy this eye, I want to try and have as much of the eye rigging done as possible, just so that there's less work to redo. And this is when not understanding glue really bites me. I continually am trying to mess with the settings. I'm continually trying to understand what I need, because what I'm trying to get here is that the weight for the glue is all on the eye line. And what that means is that the eyelid layer will just follow whatever motion the eye line does, no matter what. And the eyelid's motion won't affect the eye line at all. Because when you first set up glue, it basically has both sides be equal. When one moves, the other will move with it, and vice versa. But what I'm looking for is inequality. I want the eye line to be the primary indicator of all motion. I eventually get there. But it took a lot of finagling using the glue weight tool, which I've only just recently been starting to learn. You don't have to do any of this. You can just rig the eyelid yourself. That probably would have saved me time in this case, because I can't do any motion on the eyelid now without the eyeline, which it took me a bit to get that all looking nice. But, you know, I'm trying to learn glue, so sometimes in order to learn something new, you gotta suck at it. You gotta be bad first. And trust me, there are a lot of things in Live 2D I am still really bad at, and glue is definitely one of them. Now, with something complicated like a blink, it doesn't sound very complicated, but there's a lot of different points in between that I want to make sure look nice, because generally what Live 2D is going to do is it's going to do its best to kind of guess the two in-between points using math. And sometimes those in-between points look sticky, inky, gross. They look icky, yucky, gross. And I want them to not look icky, yucky, gross. So I will create a point in between point A and point B to clean it up. Or at least to dictate where that middle point should be, to help Live 2D understand how to get from point A to point B. You don't have to do this. It's again, just something that adds a little bit of polish. Nothing in Live 2D is set in stone. You don't have to do anything a specific way. It's all about preference, how you want something to look. And for everyone, they're gonna do it a different way. Just like art styles, Live 2D and rigging can have different rigging styles and rigging preferences. These are just ways that you can accomplish your different goals. As you could see, I was having trouble with the clipping on the eye, and I end up going back and messing with some of the layers to fix that, because wow, it was a pain. Because Live 2D only ends up having the single clipping ID, you can only really clip something once. You could clip it to multiple layers, but it'll pick the largest area of the combined clipping layers. So since I'm clipping something to the iris, if the iris moves out of its clipping layers, the other things don't care. They're still just clipped to the iris, and the iris moved. So it creates a bit of pain when the shadow goes outside of the eye. I end up just kind of chopping the mesh up so that it doesn't go outside of the area. It was just too annoying. And that does bring me to a kind of interesting random tidbit, I guess, is that in Live 2D, if part of the mesh gets cut off, like, let's say your art goes outside of the little shape that you draw for the art mesh. It's not gonna draw anything outside of that. It still exists, but it just kind of assumes it doesn't. Because under the covers, Live 2D is just putting your art on kind of 3D planes. And when you're drawing all these triangles, you're drawing the little dividers within that plane to help it understand how to squish and squash it. So if you just cut it off, it'll just cut it off. It's gonna be harsh and jagged and gross. but it certainly works. You can mirror mesh drawing, and I do that a lot for things that are big or the things that spread across the middle of the model. But if I leave it on when I don't need it, I will create mesh I don't need, and that's great. I love that. It's annoying. Just always remember to check your tool settings. But now that I have most of the eye done, I can go ahead and start copying and pasting it and find what I don't like. Because it's like flipping the canvas. Once both their sides are there, I'm going to notice things that upset me. So I go ahead and I keep futzing and I keep adjusting until I like it, and then once I'm happy, I go ahead and I use the existing rigging and just shift it to different variables. So if you click on a parameter in Live2D, which are the values that you're editing things on, you can shift where the stuff you've already rigged is applied to. I'm also going to use this to switch from normal head angles to physics-based or augmented head angles. I transfer the parameters I've already rigged onto a physics value instead of the base X value, and then I set up some physics that influence those values. And that makes the head a little extra bouncy. Again, personal preference. You don't have to do any of the things I'm doing. It's just how I do it. Now I'm gonna go ahead and I'm going physics happy. Physics is my favorite part of rigging. It's not everyone's, but I just love seeing all of the little flowy, flouncy bits come to life. And so here I'm adding physics to the eyelash. It's a little hard to see all this sped up, but I am making it kind of sway with the blink. So with this, I went ahead and rigged the motion of the eyelash swaying, and then in the physics menu, I take the eye blink as the input value. That's going to be the value that influences the movement. And then for the output value, I use the parameter that I rigged the eyelash sway on. So that basically means when the eye moves, that eyelash will sway. You can do a lot of things like inputting how much those affect each other, but that's the bare bones of how physics works. I go ahead and do the same thing to create that kind of squishy eyeball look that VTubers are famous for. I go ahead and do it for each bit of the eye, the highlights, the eye itself, and I leave the shadow in place. It's just going to move with the eye. Once I have all of the different rigs in place, I can go ahead and go back into the physics settings and do the same thing that I did for the eyelid. Because there's multiple pieces of motion here, I'm going to head and create what are called multiple pendulums. Basically what this means is that whenever there's a movement, you're going to have multiple parts along the way that all react in order. So for example, as you can see here, there's the 3 pendulums and each one is happening in sequence. The top of the pendulum is dictated by the eye blinking, and then from downward, you have the bigger highlight, the total pupil, the bigger highlight, and the smaller highlight. So it's going to move in that order, and that kind of creates that delay effect, that kind of everything moving in its own way. Because I forgot to do the physics before copying the eye, I go ahead and copy the eye again. It does mean that I have to remove all the parameters again, but that's fine. You can also duplicate physics parameters, and I do this a lot for things that are left and right adjacent. So that the physics are the same, I just have to change which the output values and input values are. So instead of the right eye, I'm going to do the left eye, and the physics for the left eye for the output values. I hope that makes sense. And now for the part of rigging that I think most people are the most intimidated by, the mouth. For me, this tends to be the most tedious part of rigging, especially in this particular case, because I didn't end up having a top lip to hide the inner mouth behind. Everything ended up being really messy. And so I ended up creating a bunch of extra value points to help Live2D interpolate between them, but it made everything take longer. But hey, like I said, when I'm trying to do things fast, I tend to make more mistakes, even though I've been doing this for a long time. So I guess that just goes to show, take your time. I know that some of you will probably be trying to rig on the free trial, and go for it. I highly recommend it, but I also highly recommend kind of understanding what you're getting into. Rigging takes time, and the live 2D free trial definitely is very generous in length, but it's still going to take time to rig a model. I think my main model took me almost over a month to do, and that was knowing what I was getting in for and understanding the program pretty well going in. If you're not as familiar with it, it's going to probably take longer, and the bigger your model, the more complicated, the more time it's going to take. But that's just going to show that, you know, when you try to rush it, it's going to be messy, and when you take your time, you can make it nicer. But anyway, the big thing that becomes complicated with rigging a mouth is just trying to make it look right in motion, and it's a lot harder to understand when all you have are form and open. What does that mean? For me, the way that I've always thought about it is that the top part of form is like, ah, and the bottom part of form is like, oh. What I mean to say is your mouth will be the widest at ah, and your mouth will be the thinnest at oh. And you kind of just want the 0 to be the middle of that. So basically, as the mouth form goes up, your mouth stretches out, and as the mouth form goes down, your mouth squishes in. That's going to create that kind of really nice O shapes as you're talking, and you can have as many points as you want in between that, but that's the basis. There's also a lot of mouth charts out there that can help guide you along which points generally look like what. I've even made some in the past. I've just memorized them at this point, and I just kind of go wild, go crazy. I also tend to like to have a 0.1 open so that I can really make sure when my mouth opens, it looks nice at the lowest value, because those low values tend to get crazy. Because that's when your mouth is going from all squished up behind the lines to open. It can really interpolate in weird ways. But overall, it's mostly just doing the same thing over and over again. One thing that I do that helps me a lot, though, is I try to get the big mouth forms out of the way for mouth closed, and one big mouth open, and then fine-tune along the way. As you can see here, I'm struggling. I'm on the struggle bus, but that's okay. I just gotta sort it out. Rigging is hard. It's gonna take time, and sometimes the program just won't do what you want, and your deformer gets all gross and yucky and looks bad. It just happens, and that's okay. Your deformer doesn't have to look pretty as long as the rigging does. Though, the nicer your deformers look, the easier life 2D will have with interpolating it, so, you know, things to keep in mind. For me, when I'm doing mouths, I also just like to use Control-Shift-C, or copy form, and Control-Shift-V, or paste form, to help me replicate in between poses. So like, if I'm working on 2 points in between smiling and maximum smiling, aka, for me, form 0 and form 1, I want to kind of have a starting point as opposed to just whatever was keyed when I originally set up those points. And so for me, I can use that to create a starting point. Basically, it'll copy the form of wherever I copy from and paste it onto the points that I, you know, need it to go on. So when I'm rigging the negative forms of the mouth, I really try to push the ooh. And since I tend to have dimples on my characters, which is what I call the little dots on the edge of the mouth, I try to hide them within the lines of the mouth to make that shape even rounder. I really want it to be nice and round, because that's going to create a nice O shape when I'm talking. I also like to make sure that I'm keeping the teeth on the bottom in view but I'm also trying to make sure I don't move the top teeth too much. In reality, we don't move our upper jaw a whole lot. We tend to mostly move our lower jaw. So if you move the top teeth a lot, it's going to look a little weird. It's going to look a little like your teeth are disconnected from your mouth. And I don't think we want our teeth to be disconnected from our mouth. Another thing to keep in mind is that, similarly, our top lip tends to not move as much as our bottom lip. Our top lip will move away from our teeth, but it doesn't really move up and down in the same way that our jaw can. Since the bottom lip has the full motion of the jaw, your top lip will kind of stay at the same height for every mouth form. You know, maybe push to a bit of an extreme for the upmost mouth open shapes, but overall, you want the bottom jaw to be doing most of the work. Again, that's not necessarily something you have to follow. That's just going to make it look more in line with how our mouths move in real life. So if you want to push something more cartoony, go for it. We're always down for experimental VTubers in this house. Another thing to keep in mind is that if you rig something and you don't like where it ended up, you can move it. You can adjust it. It doesn't have to be set and done. Hell knows, I can't do it that way. This is where we sort of start to run into the everything's messy because I fucked up. And it just kind of keeps being here for a while. Another thing that I use a lot when I'm rigging the mouth is that I like to use one of Live2D's new features in the physics window. You can hook up VTube Studio to Live2D and have it show you how the mouth is looking in real time, and I love that. I can feel how the mouth is. Granted, it'll use whatever settings the model you are using has, so if you haven't set up the model to match with your mouth movements, the model in Live2D isn't gonna magically know what to do. The model will just follow whatever numbers VTube Studio is giving it. You can also go ahead and use its random posing feature, which might look a little crazy if you end up doing the wide-eye rigging that I have, which is basically from 0.9 to 1 on the eyes get smaller and the eyelids move away, which gives you a nice surprised look. Which is what the random posing is going to always have. But again, pros and cons. I really like it when I'm actually using the model, but it does make Live2D look a little crazy. All that said, I think that the mouth is just a big case of trial and error. You're gonna mess with things, you're gonna see what works, see what doesn't, and feel it out. Some people like to have really dynamic mouths that they add like references for where their mouth is, what their mouth should look like closed, what their mouth should look like open, and those can look really pretty. They might not interpolate the best, so you'll need to do a little bit more work on the in-between points, so that's just something that happens depending on how you end up doing your mouth. I tend to prefer doing less points, which may sound a little silly given how many points I have on this example mouth because of said messy inner mouth situation that I end up having going on. I tried to rush it too much. The raw footage of this video is like 4 hours, so, you know, that's very fast for making a model. So of course it's gonna have some messy bits here and there. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how it came out. At least in terms of it looking nice. In motion. Just don't look too closely. But I think that that's really how it is. Models might have messy corners. They might have bits that don't look nice. But you might never hit those corners. You might never, in reality of using the model, see that messy little head angle of turning your head to this degree and then that other degree that would break your neck in real life, but you have to rig it. All that to say is that when you're rigging, it's okay to mess up, and it's okay to keep trying and keep experimenting. I know I do. I've been experimenting since I started rigging, gosh, 4 years ago? Over 4 years ago? My first model is a lot simpler and didn't have really anything other than a head and some drawstrings on a hoodie that was rigged, and it's still one that's pretty charming in its own way. And I made it over a weekend using the live 2D free trial because I was too scared to try anything different. I wasn't sure if I could re-import things, and I wasn't really knowing what I was getting myself into. But the more you do it, the more it's going to become something you understand. It feels almost like sculpting sometimes. You're just taking the art that you were given and sculpting it into different positions to make the motion work. You're creating the illusion of depth. It's all an illusion. So if you have to do something that doesn't feel right, it feels wrong, but it looks right, go for it. If you don't want to because it feels wrong, also go for it. Live 2D is an art form. Rigging is an art form. There's a lot of little tricks you can do to make things look nicer, like the more open the jaw is, you move the chin or move the nose. Because our faces scrunch, our skin moves. But you don't have to. You can rig your model the way you want. It's yours. And I think that that's the most important thing that I can impart to you. When I rig my models, I have fun with it. I experiment. No matter how many models I make, I'm always learning new things. So just remember that Live 2D is hard, but it's also something that you can play with, like Play-Doh. Live 2D is like Play-Doh. So don't just get discouraged. It has a lot of different bells and whistles, but bells and whistles can play pretty songs. Anyway, here's how the model came out. Here's me using it, and thanks for listening. If you have any questions, again, leave them in the comments, and see you around next time. Remember to take care of yourselves. Bye-bye!